began shooting, it was considered almost shameful for a woman to shoot. That was a man's business, you see. It was uphill work, for when I began, there was a prejudice to live down. Annie Oakley, 1917.
When it comes to the ideal of the strong, independent woman of the West, no character in history seems to fit the image better than Little Sure Shot, the champion sharpshooter, Annie Oakley.
It didn't matter that she wasn't from the West and never lived west of the Mississippi. Nonetheless, she was the Westerner. She embodied all those traits that people like to think belong to a Western woman.
Phoebe Ann Moses, later to become the world-famous Annie Oakley, was born in 1860 in the backwoods of Darke County, Ohio. When she was 6 years old, her father died, and Annie learned to trap and shoot small game just to put food on the family table.
I was 8 years old when I took my first shot, and I still consider it one of the best shots I ever made. Annie Oakley.
She had enough of an eye, enough of a natural sense of aim that she proved to be very proficient. It became important to the family because she became a major provider for the family.
But even with Annie's help, her mother couldn't feed 4 hungry children alone. At the age of 10, Annie was sent to live with a local farmer and his wife. In later years, Annie refused to give the name of the couple who severely abused her for 2 years. She would only refer to them as the Wolves.
Her foster parents would beat her and lock her in a dark closet for hours and hours at a time. It's a terrible thing to imagine America's sweetheart growing up this way. I think it's one of our great kind of dark secrets of our heritage.
They were unusually strict, I gather, cheap, mean. They lied to her. They told her folks, in fact, they told her mother that she didn't want to go home. And they told her that her mother didn't want her back. It was a very unnatural and nasty situation. She was a slave for 2 years. I think her personality was probably strongly affected by that time. There's a suppressed anger in her for the rest of her life.
In 1872, Annie ran away from the Wolves and was eventually reunited with her family. To help supplement their income, she began supplying local merchants with fresh game to be shipped to hotels and restaurants in Cincinnati.
People around town appreciated her skill as a hunter because it was said that there was never any shot in the food that the diners ate when it had come from her because she always made her shots in the head.
By the time I had reached 14, I had paid off a mortgage on my father's homestead with money earned from the sale of game and skins.
Annie also showcased her rifle skills by entering and winning a number of local turkey shoots. Her growing reputation would lead to a fateful meeting with the showman and sharpshooter Frank Butler.
Frank Butler was an Irish immigrant who came to this country and worked his way to a place on the American stage. This is at a time in American history when shooting, sport shooting, and competition shooting was very popular, and Butler was good at it.
While passing through Ohio, Butler met a man who challenged him to a match with a local unknown.
I almost dropped dead when a little slim girl in short dresses stepped out to the mark with me. I was a beaten man the moment she appeared. Right then and there, I decided if I could get that girl, I would do it. Frank Butler, 1924.
They shot evenly for 24 birds, and on the 25th bird, he missed. But he was a very gracious loser. He thanked her for the match, complimented her on her skill, and then courted her for a year.
There's a charming little girl. She's many miles from here. She's a loving little fairy. You'd fall in love to see her. Her presence would remind you of an angel in the skies. And you bet I love this little girl with the raindrops in her eyes. Frank Butler, 1881.
He was in his 20s when they met. She was 15, and yet within a year, they were married. The story is that Butler's partner, a fellow named Graham, was ill, and she was called up as a member of the audience. and was so obviously good at it and so charming and such a novelty to the audience that Graham was never heard of again. At some time, she adopted the name Oakley as a stage name, and nobody knows why. And Butler and Oakley became a shooting sensation.
From that day to this, I have not competed with her in public shooting. She outclassed me. Frank Butler, 1925.
Took on the role of business manager for the act, and Annie became the star attraction. In the winter of 1884, they happened to be on tour in New Orleans at the same time. Buffalo Bill's Wild West was in town.
In the spring of '85, Annie Oakley tried out, sold everyone who saw her very quickly, and within 15 minutes apparently had her first contract with the Wild West.
From her very first performance with Buffalo Bill's Wild West, Annie Oakley was a sensation.
She handles a shotgun with an easy familiarity that causes the men to marvel and the women to assume airs of contented superiority. Springfield, Massachusetts Republican, 1897.
She could do miracles with a rifle. It was just incredible. Frank would stand there with a cigarette in his mouth, and she was a long ways out there. Shoot it out of his mouth, and she never missed.
She shot using mirrors. She shot using more than one gun. In some years, she rode bicycles and shot from the back of a bicycle. In some years, she rode horses. She had some sort of magnetism that can only come from within. In private, she was quiet and reserved, but in public, she could reach the masses.
Among Annie's biggest fans was Chief Sitting Bull. He honored her with an Indian name meaning Little Sure Shot and adopted her as one of the Sioux people.
One of the things that must have impressed Sitting Bull, that is her skill at handling a man's weapon. She was a woman who could take care of herself, who was confident of herself and her skills, and yet who was never threatening to the men she was with.
When the Wild West went abroad to Europe, little Annie from Ohio became an internationally famous star.
All of the performers of the Wild West were invited to give a special performance for the Queen of England. The performers were presented to the Prince, Prince Edward, and his wife, Princess Alexandra. And Annie Oakley marched up and shook Alexandra's hand. Instead of walking up and curtsying to the king-to-be, she shook Alexandra's hand.
You'll have to excuse me, please, because I'm an American, and in America, ladies come first. Annie Oakley to the Prince of Wales, 1887.
There's no question that she was the highest paid performer in the show, aside probably from Buffalo Bill himself. But Annie Oakley stated a few times that she was making as much as 5 times as much as the Cowboys. She had a reputation for being a tightwad, for being very close with her money. She and Frank banked as much as they could.
Annie and Frank toured with other Wild West shows, and she even tried her hand at acting, but they were always loyal to Buffalo Bill. Then in 1903, an item appeared in the national newspapers that would bring out the fighter in America's sweetheart.
Annie Oakley, the most famous rifle shot in the world, lies today in a cell at the Harrison Street station for stealing the trousers of a Negro in order to buy cocaine. Chicago American, August 11th, 1903.
Well, of course, it wasn't true. She was so outraged. It so went contrary to her character that she sued against every newspaper that had run that story. And she won in virtually all of them. I think that below the surface was always a very strong need for her to prove herself a good person, a worthwhile person, a strong person. And when she was challenged on it, that suppressed anger would burst forth.
As I have taught over 15,000 women how to shoot, I modestly feel that I have some right to speak with assurance on this subject. Individual for individual, women shoot as well as men. Annie Oakley, 1926.
A crack shot well into her 60s, Annie spent many of her golden years working to advance the independence of the American woman.